They are the artists who put the pop in American pop. Marvin Gaye, The Platters, Van Morrison, Tom Jones, the Everly Brothers, Ray Charles, Dionne Warwick, Jose Feliciano, Willie Nelson, James Brown. This is the series that goes backstage and tells the stories of those who entered the recording studio and created gold. This is Music Legends, and you've got a seat at front and center.
A lot of people may say that Willie Nelson is country and not pop, but when you're as pop as he is, you're pop. He crosses every genre in music. He's way too big to be considered just a country star.
The two audiences, country and pop, have boundaries, you know, but he's always made it okay to cross over.
Every once in a while a pop guy gets a hit in country or a country hit gets a hit in pop. He's broken those barriers for years. He's the real deal as far as his upbringing, born in Fort Worth in April 1933.
You know, he's been around forever. He's worked for a long time, but he really didn't become a big star till the 1970s. In the 60s, he was busy writing songs for other people, big country stars.
He wrote Nightlife for Ray Price back when he was a songwriter for hire.
One of the classic songs of all times, made famous by Patsy Cline, Crazy, was written by Willie Nelson.
Hello Walls was a huge hit for Theron Young. It was enormous.
Billy Walker had a hit when Willie wrote Funny How Time Slips Away.
As he was writing for other artists, he was also making his own recordings. He had a tiny but quite devoted following as he kept making one small-selling album after the other.
Liberty released some of these very early Willie Nelson albums. So did RCA. It was in the early 1970s when he started being known as a performer in his own right.
When Willie teamed up with Waylon Jennings, that was when the public started to hear more about him. Together they created Outlaw Country.
Chris Christopherson poked his head into this movement for a bit. Later, Johnny Cash, of course, came along and added a note or two to this country outlaw movement that Willie and Waylon had developed.
If anything, early on, Willie Nelson was the least known. Waylon was the bigger star of the two.
So Willie had the most to gain when he started this outlaw country sound. And it's interesting that Willie Nelson actually became bigger than anybody else that was playing country at that time.
By 1975, I think mostly at that time because of his partnership with Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson had become a star. Waylon Jennings helped him get attention, but it was really Willie's own album in 1975 that shot him into the big leagues.
Red-Headed Stranger. That made people sit up and take notice.
Red-Headed Stranger really had the feel of the time, post-rock, pre-disco.
Bicentennial was coming up and we elected Jimmy Carter, who was a Southern product from Georgia. Burt Reynolds and all that good old boy humor, CB radios and all that stuff was in style.
Blue Eyes, Crying in the Rain was one of the best songs that came off the Red-Headed Stranger album.
Actually, it's kind of ironic because Willie was this fantastic writer, but he didn't write Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain.
That song by Fred Rose was a big hit for Roy Acuff in the 40s. But Willie's version was big enough for Freddie Fender to get a cover in Spanish out. And even that was a hit, so they were both hits.
By the mid-70s, Willie was huge. Not only did he cross over from country to pop, but he crossed over from cult to mainstream. The most amazing thing was, he never really did a pop song, so when he finally recorded one, it just broke huge.
By the early 80s, he was acting in films, and it wasn't even something he actually pursued.
After he became a star, he never played it safe. He always experimented with his music.
He tried some Western swing stuff, jazz, honky-tonk, blues. He always incorporated blues into it.
It was his warm personality and his elastic talent, though, that really made everybody enjoy Willie from cowboy to rocker. As big as he was, everything changed for him in the 1980s.
His fans weren't really very surprised when they found out he was kind of rebellious in his life as well as in his music.
It wasn't that he was a real outlaw when it came to taxes, but he did have some real problems.
But when he really got in trouble with the IRS, America was shocked.
His problems with the IRS became legend, and he never hid his problems about marijuana.
You got to go back to the beginning to see why people still love this guy so much. When he was a kid, he was performing at a young age. He was born in Fort Worth, but grew up in Abbott, Texas.
His life was just like a country song. His dad died when he was very young, and his mother ran away shortly thereafter.
Their grandparents wanted them to learn music. Willie took to the guitar and his sister played piano. By the time he was 7, he was playing away and writing original music.
As they grew up, Willie and his sister knew a fiddle player by the name of Bud Fletcher.
Bud Fletcher had a popular band in the region called Ray Check's Polka Band.
Bud started dating Willie's sister, and before long, they were married.
Of course, Willie and his sister both played with Ray Check's and the Polka Band.
Willie Nelson was the leader of Ray Check's polka band right up through his high school years.
After high school, Willie Nelson left Ray Check's polka band and joined the Air Force.
Willie had severe back problems. So severe it limited his time in the Air Force. He got a disenrollment from the service. His back was really that bad.
So there he was, without a job, back on the street, looking for a future.
In 1954, he got a job as a DJ in Fort Worth, Texas. The station was KCNC Fort Worth, and it really did well in that market.
He still wanted to make it as a musician.
He went back to the two things he'd done before, being a DJ and playing honky-tonk.
By 1956, he knew he had to put his heart and soul into music, not disc jockey work.
Willie met Leon Payne, who at the time was a DJ and a songwriter of his own.
Payne wrote a song called Lumberjack, which of course would have had a huge audience up there in Washington.
That wasn't the worst thing for Willie. His DJ wanted him to record a composition, and he was totally unknown. The best part was that Leon Payne had a lot of control at that radio station, and he played that thing all the time.
Together they sold about 3,000 copies of Lumberjack, which really was not bad for a really small company.
So even after this little burst of fame, if you can call it that, Willie had to go look for work again.
He wrote a song to use as a guitar teacher called Family Bible.
He made $50 selling the song, and by the 1960s, a singer named Claude Gray was on the radio playing it. When Family Bible became a hit for Claude Gray, Willie knew he had what it took.
He cut some songs back in Nashville, some demos, and he sang on the demos.
Back then his voice was out of style. They said his voice was too nasal.
All the sounds and tones in his voice that eventually would make him a star held him back in the 60s.
Back in the 60s, voices like Ray Price was what people wanted.
So even though his voice wasn't loved back in Nashville, his songwriting was.
Hank Cochran heard one of his demos and he got him a job at Pamper Music.
Willie had written a song called Nightlife, which he sold to Ray Price when he got to Pamper Music.
Well, Ray Price was huge back then, and he also co-owned Pamper.
After Ray recorded Nightlife, it was a big hit. This was Willie's really important break.
So with Ray Price at the beginning of the 60s is when it started coming together for Willie.
Ray's road band was called the Cherokee Cowboys, and he made Willie his new bass player.
Even though he was touring with Ray Price, he was allowed to sell other songs to other artists.
This is when he wrote Hello Walls, and Fair and Young recorded it. Hello Walls went to #1 on the country charts in just 9 weeks, which was pretty fast for that time.
One of the big steps in Willie Nelson's career was when Billy Walker recorded Funny How Time Slips Away.
Oh, and Patsy recorded Crazy. That was something of a turning point because that's when Willie crossed over into pop. With all these hits, it seemed like the sky was the limit for Willie.
Everybody wanted his songs, but he wanted something that seemed beyond his grasp, and that was his own recording career. No, he made records when he was back as a hot songwriter, but he wasn't breaking through as a singer.
He was married to a singer back then named Shirley Cawley, and they recorded a duet together called Willingly. That was in 1962 when the couple recorded that for a company called Liberty.
Willingly made it in the top 10. Right around that time, he had another chart hit.
Willingly and Touch Me were two songs that Willie sang on, and after he did that, people knew he was ready.
The songs after Touch Me and Willingly barely made the top 40, so he was having a pretty tough time.
He was in the game where charts really control your fate at that time.
He recorded with the label Liberty until 1964, and then they closed their country music division.
It was a bright spot back in '64 when he wrote a hit song for Roy Orbison called Pretty Paper.
When Roy Orbison did well with Pretty Paper, It sort of reinforced the idea that Willie should write, not sing. And so he did get a recording contract with Monument.
He made some records with Monument, but none of them really took off, so he left them.
In 1965, Willie Nelson signed with RCA Records. That really was hitting the big time, but for some reason, Willie really didn't feel that way. At the time, things were tough, but RCA really could see what a talent that Willie Nelson was.
Even though RCA had a lot of faith in Willie, they couldn't just ignore the setbacks that had happened at Monument and Liberty.
That's the strength of big companies. They can find talent and nurture people that they think need some care. Whether it was with Liberty, Monument, or RCA, Willie was already becoming a mainstay in country music.
The year he signed with RCA was the same year that he became a member of the Grand Ole Opry. For the next 7 years, he made several recordings for RCA in Nashville.
You know, none of the albums or songs really took off during that initial period with RCA.
RCA wanted him to have this huge, overproduced sound, and Willie wanted it simple.
It seemed like it was a pretty good mismatch between RCA and Willie, because by 1972 he couldn't even crack the top 40. He'd blame the label would blame him. So by the mid-70s, Willie quit.
He didn't just quit RCA, he quit writing, he quit singing, he quit everything. He just quit.
He went back to Texas and became a pig farmer. And other people thought that that was a joke, but that's really what he did.
It's hard to believe. But in 1972, he quit show business. It was done, it was over.
Thank God for the world of music, because he had a horrible time. It was a disaster being a pig farmer.
Beyond his bad luck as a pig farmer, something else began to take shape for Willie during the early 70s. If you think back, you remember all that was happening. The world of rock began listening to country.
Rock fans didn't listen to just any country artist. They decided for themselves who was cool and who wasn't.
ZZ Top and Dolly Parton. Pretty different sounds, but they were a part of this thing that was going on between pop and country.
Without the crossover mentality that was present at that time, we never would have had the crossover hits like the Eagles and John Denver.
With what was going on at the time, Willie's stuff didn't exactly offend rockers, but it wasn't what they had in their head of a preconceived notion about what country should sound like.
With his odd voice and unique phrasing, he was becoming a cool sort of cult hit with young music listeners.
He saw the chance to reinvent himself as a rock and roll rebel that went country.
He was smart. He got rid of the Nashville image that wanted him to be George Jones.
It was a risky move for him to try to find that ground and sound between hard rock and country, but he did it.
The outlaw thing he created caught fire right away. Pretty soon he left the pig farm and signed with Atlantic Records. In 1973 he grew his hair and recorded Shotgun Willie. It was his first album for Atlantic.
Shotgun Willie was an amazing album. It didn't sell particularly well, but the critics absolutely loved it.
The music press saw Shotgun Willie as an important transition into pop. It was important for Willie. Shotgun Willie created something of an instant cult. Rockers who had never heard of Hank Williams all of a sudden loved Willie.
Same year Shotgun Willie hit, Nelson's cover of Stay All Night made it into the top 40.
In 1974, he was on a roll, and he made a concept album named Phases and Stages.
Bob Wills had an old song that Willie made into a hit. In 1973, it was called Stay All Night.
After the Fire Is Gone made it on the charts and made Phases and Stages an even hotter album that year.
Red-Headed Stranger was the album he made with Columbia after he left Atlantic.
His stay in Atlantic Records was real short, but he really proved himself, and it was enough that Columbia took him on.
This was the first album he made for Columbia, and they weren't really sure what he was up to because it was stripped down.
Columbia Records was nervous. The album was just Willie, the guitar and singing, and his sister on the piano.
When the first single became a huge hit, the company just breathed a sigh of relief.
Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain shot off the charts like something nobody had ever seen.
Here was this old Ray Acuff song that was decades old, but he made it sound like it had never been played before.
The fact is, it hit all the charts. I mean, it was loved by kids, children, country fans. I mean, it was unprecedented.
And while he was working on Red-Headed Stranger, he was also working on The Outlaw Thing with Waylon. Like Willie, Waylon's success was kind of spotty in all those years coming up in Nashville.
It was beyond question that Nashville was the power base for country music.
But the two of them, both Willie and Waylon, had both had a chip on their shoulder when it came to Nashville.
Like all the things of that time, everything was being questioned in government, music, culture.
Everything was counterculture. All in the Family was on TV, Vietnam was being protested, Watergate was raging, all of this. Willie and Waylon thought, why should Nashville decide if Nelson and Jennings should make it in country music?
The album was called Wanted, The Outlaws, and it came out about the same time as Red-Headed Stranger.
Wanted, The Outlaws was one of those albums that had a lot of different artists doing a lot of different tracks.
Some of the tracks were previously recorded, but the biggest hit was something from Willie and Waylon.
Good-Hearted Woman was another song that played on all the radio stations and made Willie and Waylon very popular.
Willie Nelson hadn't just arrived. He suddenly made the old guard of Nashville look old, tired, and out of touch.
For the next 5 years, you couldn't even go through a day without hearing about Willie, or at least hearing some of his songs. Willie Nelson paved the way for a bunch of guys that had been banging around Nashville for years.
Willie Nelson tore down a lot of walls for artists like Kenny Rogers. It was a nice crossover for him from pop to country.
Uncloudy Day made it into the top 10 of all the country charts.
In 1976, he had a bunch of hits racked up. His song, If You've Got the Money, I've Got the Time, was a big hit.
The single I Love You 1,000 Ways made it to the top of the charts in 1977.
As big as he was, nobody was quite ready for just how big he was going to be in 1978. In '78, he put out two albums that were nothing like each other, but both of them became huge.
Willie was pretty well known as a solo, but his fans loved the fact that he was humble enough and cool enough to work with lots of other people, especially Waylon.
Everybody wanted a follow-up to the Outlaws project, so they put out Waylon and Willie in 1978.
Audiences could see there was a real friendship going on there between Waylon and Willie.
Mama's Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys came off the Waylon and Willie album. It was gigantic.
Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys was a song that helped redefine what a hit was in country music. So just as Willie was coming out with his album with Waylon Jennings, he came out with another album that was much more risky.
In the same year of the Waylon and Willie album, he puts out Stardust, a glossy album of old pop standards.
Stardust was produced by Booker T. Jones, and it was a gamble, a big gamble from start to finish.
Stardust had big violins and big band covers. Everybody thought he was going to fall on his face for this one.
Well, think about the year. It was the height of disco, and he's a country singer, and he does something like Stardust?
You know, he's singing those old standards like Sinatra did years ago, the kind of stuff they were doing in Vegas. And in saloons, it was a true testament to Willie that he could bring something fresh with his voice to these old standards.
As big as his country albums were, when it came to Stardust, well, that album was along for a long, long time.
For 10 years, one way or another, that album stayed on the country charts. The song Stardust made the whole entertainment industry sit up and take notice and said, wow, this guy's made of gold.
Robert Redford wanted him in movies by then. He put Willie Nelson in Electric Horseman. After Electric Horseman, Willie was ready for some much bigger roles, and he was put in the movie called Honeysuckle Rose in 1980.
The song On the Road Again was a big hit in the movie Honeysuckle Rose, and it was huge. In 1982, he did a cover of an Elvis Presley song, which gave him yet another signature song.
Willie's version, the #1 song for 2 weeks on the country charts.
It jumped the pop charts and was sold in stores that usually didn't sell country. Always on my mind when quadruple platinum, and at that time there weren't many albums that did that.
Everybody wanted to be making albums with Willie after that. They wanted to be part of what he was doing. Willie and Merle Haggard made an album in 1983 called Poncho and Lefty.
He made 2 more albums with Waylon. In 1982, he made an album called WW2, which meant Waylon and Willie 2. In 1983, Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson made yet 1 more album together. That was called Take It to the Limit.
Julio Iglesias was a big Latin star, but most people in America had never heard of him until he recorded with Willie Nelson in 1984. They recorded All the Girls I've Loved Before, which was yet another pop to country crossover hit.
He had a few more hits after that Iglesias duet, but after that he really kind of went back more to his country roots. By 1985 he had this super group of legends called the Highwaymen.
The Highwaymen consisted of Waylon, Willie, Chris Christopherson, and Johnny Cash.
The Highwaymen was great, but by then, a whole new group of young artists like Garth Brooks was taking over.
Actually, it seemed like Johnny Cash and Christopherson wanted to see if they could recreate the outlaw success of Waylon and Willie.
As the 80s were ending, Willie did not record as much, but he went on tour. But he didn't have anything to prove anymore.
He became more than a legendary singer to Middle America when he put together Farm Aid.
So here he is doing all this good for Farm Aid and all of the other charities he was doing, and yet his life changed forever.
Farmers were hurting in the mid to late 80s, and Willie Nelson founded charity concerts to help them.
One day, he simply gets his bill from the IRS for $16.7 million in back taxes. Can you imagine that?
This bill wasn't a real surprise. He was always having battles with the IRS, but this time they really nailed him.
He even made an album to help pay for this. It was called the IRS Tapes, Who Will Buy My Memories?
In 1991, he had to turn over houses, cars, studios, all kinds of things to pay for that tax bill.
These IRS tapes were sold on television, and all the money was used to pay the IRS.
By 1993, he had paid off his debt, was 60 years old, and had nothing. He made a very personal and well-received album in 1993 called Across the Borderline, produced by Don Was.
He had a lot of big names and old friends appear on the Across the Borderline album.
Both David Crosby and Chris Christopherson sang on Across the Borderline, along with a few other artists.
Bob Dylan was on that album, along with Sinead O'Connor, Paul Simon, and Bonnie Raitt.
The album made it right up on the charts and showed that people still wanted to hear what Willie Nelson had to sing about.
Since Across the Borderline, he put out one album a year. He's never off the road. My guess is he's probably paying his taxes on time now.
In 1993, he was introduced into the Country Music Hall of Fame, which is no surprise. He switched labels yet again in 1996 when he went to Island Records.
His first album for Island Records was a well-received project called Spirit. And he's made many an album since Spirit, and it keeps working and working.
If you look back over his overall story, you really get a sense of how little the so-called powerful people know about this business. Here's the music industry. A young Willie Nelson simply bangs around in it for years.
All the people that were supposed to know told Willie that his voice was not commercial at all and he just wasn't supposed to sing. These people told him, stay away from the microphones and the cameras, just stay with songwriting.
Willie's an inspiration. He never lost his sense of humor, and he never gave up. Not only that, he sharpened his skills until the world of pop music finally caught up to Willie.